Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the second annual YCT Climate Conference. I'm Rabbi Haggai Resnikoff, Director of Community Learning at YCT, and we're just minutes away from getting started. Before we do, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. They are Porat, the Interfaith Public Health Network, International Rabbinic Fellowship, Lighthouse K Kashrus Organization, Yeshivat Maharat, Uri L'Tzedek, Torat Chaim, Congregation Beth Shalom in Providence, Jewish Climate Action Network NYC, Jewish Earth Alliance, Chazon, and Dayeno. I want to remind everyone, and I will frequently over the course of this conference, that closed captioning is available for this entire conference. Just press the closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. Because of the closed captioning, we ask that the chat be used solely to communicate in technical issues. There will be times when you'll be invited to put questions in the chat. Otherwise, please keep the chat clear for the benefit of those using closed captioning. Finally, you are muted. You will be muted for the duration of the whole conference. You will, as I said, have opportunities to add questions from the chat, ask questions from the chat, but I ask that you do not unmute yourselves under any circumstance. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Friedman and Rabbi Hody Nemes, who will frame the next 3 hours for us. Dr. Michelle Friedman is the founder of the Sharon and Stephen Lieberman Chair in Pastoral Counseling at YCT. She received an MD from the NYU State School of Medicine and has completed advanced training at the Columbia University Psychoanalytic Center for Training and Research. Dr. Friedman is a highly respected psychiatrist who focuses on the Jewish community and has special interest in the rabbinate and pastoral counseling. In addition to her private practice and her role at YCT, Dr. Friedman is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Mount Sinai Hospital, New York. Rabbi Hody Nemes is a climate change activist and rabbi. I would say that in the opposite order. As a rabbi and climate change activist. He graduated Yale University with a degree in environmental studies and received smicha from YCT in June, this past June. In 2016, Hody co-founded Jewish Climate Action Network NYC, a grassroots climate advocacy group which he continues to help lead. He previously served as manager of greening and climate initiatives at Chazon, where he helped develop a seal of sustainability for Jewish organizations across the country. He has presented about climate change to Jewish audiences across the country. Dr. Friedman, Rav Nemes, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm Dr. Michelle Friedman. I am a psychiatrist and chair of pastoral counseling at YCT Rabbinical School. And so for me, in both of these roles, everything starts with a story. So I want to tell you about a picnic I went to a few years ago. It was before the pandemic. The picnic was at the independent living senior community where my mom, who is 93, lives. Many observant Jews live there, and it's run under Orthodox auspices. Very careful attention is paid to kashrus, Shabbos, the availability of the sukkah, and many other kinds of matters. Now, the picnic, which usually happens in August, is a lovely annual event. Adult children of the residents, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren frolic and run around together. Some are wearing long skirts and stockings, others in jeans, t-shirts, and even a halter top with a tattoo or two showing. And the food is summer delicious treats. Corn on the cob, hot dogs, watermelon, but served on styrofoam plates, loads of plastic utensils, straws everywhere, drinks out of those big red plastic cups. Now, I was not yet an identified climate activist, but I cared about the environment, and I was raised on a farm by Holocaust survivor parents who could not stand waste. I went up to the organizer, I thanked them for putting on the picnic, and I said, look at these beautiful children. They are our future, and we need to think about a clean, safe world for them. Might you consider using paper goods instead of styrofoam? How about recyclable or biodegradable products? They looked at me like I had 3, maybe 4 heads. And I didn't stop. I wrote emails to the administration, and I got bland, like shoving me off answers. Now, I know that one picnic is not going to change the fate of our planet, but we Jews have a responsibility to think about our collective climate impact. Let's do some rough estimates. Assuming that there's a little over 6 million Jews in the United States, based on current rates of American emissions, we American Jews produce about 114 megatons of carbon emissions per year. If the American Jewish community were ranked as a country, we would have a higher annual emission rate than 150 other countries, including Norway, Hungary, and obviously 148 others. And actually, that estimate might be low, because when you consider our many trips, thank God, to Israel, our institutional buildings, synagogues, schools, JCCs, our vast infrastructure, and as per my story, the amount of wasted food, plastics at our many kiddushes, our large-scale celebrations, and community events, all Baruch Hashem in the service of community, but leaving a big footprint. Now, something we're talking about tonight is that Orthodox voices have largely been absent from climate discussions. I'll suggest some reasons now, and one of our breakout groups will delve further into this. Just to name a few possible barriers on people's minds, well, we don't have an established tradition of climate concern or a corresponding halacha, a legal tradition. And there's already so much to do to maintain religious life. And not last but not least, climate activism is often seen as aligned with progressive agendas that many Orthodox Jews feel is uncomfortable or even alien to them. And so we come to tonight. The aim for this conference is for you to deepen your halakhic and personal motivation, hopefully they're fused, for climate involvement, and also to motivate you to find your own niche for activism. To close, our Torah charges us with responsibility to the larger world. We are supposed to be an or legoyim, a light unto the nations. So whether that light is powered by solar energy or wind or something else, let's see it shine. It is my pleasure to turn the mic, the Zoom over to my colleague and friend, Rabbi Hody Nemes.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. It's so nice to be with all of you. Dr. Friedman mentioned that Orthodox voices, well, we need more Orthodox voices in the climate movement. And tonight we're going to hear actually from a lot of them, plus a range of other people of all Jewish backgrounds and beyond the Jewish community who are working every day on this immense issue. I'm just going to briefly share my screen to show you the agenda. Can you give a thumbs up, Michelle, if you see that? Great. Okay, here is the agenda. We're going to start off with Rabbi Resnikoff presenting a groundbreaking tshuva on climate change. We'll hear some responses to that from some rabbis in Israel and here, and have an opportunity for some Q&A. And then we'll turn to a conversation about Shemitah and climate justice, getting into some of the depths of the impact of this of climate change on our most vulnerable populations. We'll have then a break, and we'll get to actually go into breakout groups to dive down a little deeper and really get to talk in smaller groups, from how to green your community to this topic of orthodoxy and climate activism, climate advocacy. I'll be moderating that, I recommend it, and climate economics. Those are the 4 options. So you can take the next hour and a half or so to decide where you would like to learn. And this is really a fantastic opportunity. We're going to just stop that. So before we go deeper and turn to our other speakers, it's really important, I think, just to remind ourselves, why is this so urgent? Why are we talking about climate change to begin with? I would love to do a half-hour deep dive into the science of climate change, but we don't have time. So I will just say that if you've even glanced at a newspaper in the last 3 weeks, you recognize that climate change is affecting us on a daily basis, from floods in Europe that killed tragically 200 people to 1 million people displaced in China over recent flooding. Earlier this month, the Pacific Northwest just baked. It really baked. And in British Columbia, temperatures were about 50 degrees Celsius. That's about halfway to the boiling point of your boiling pot of pasta. That's how bad it's getting. Just in this past month. And where heat goes, fire of course follows. In the Pacific Northwest, there were fires, terrible fires, and the ash actually came here to New York City. Anybody who took a look at the sun last Wednesday or Tuesday, you might have noticed that it had turned red. And that was because of a massive amount of pollution that had settled on us. We thought we were far away from the Pacific Northwest, but in fact, climate change is a global phenomenon, and it affects us in increasingly intricate and interconnected ways. I took a screenshot of this from my phone on Wednesday. This was New York City, the most polluted city in the world on Wednesday and Tuesday. And I was afraid to let my kids go outside to play. So this is just one small little nugget of how climate change is affecting us now in increasingly dangerous ways. And the thing that always terrifies me most is that today about 1% of the world is a barely livable hot zone. By about 50 years from now, that portion could go up to about a fifth, 19%. And where are all those people there going to go? People who won't even be able to go outside because it'd be so hot. So that is the challenge facing us. That is really the profound challenge. We're talking about hundreds, perhaps 150 million people who could die with just a half a degree of warming, which we are on track for within the next perhaps decade. So in the face of this, hundreds of millions of lives are at stake. What does our tradition have to say? And when I was a reporter in 2014 at the largest climate march in history, I noticed there were a lot of Jews, but not so many Orthodox Jews. And this bothered me. I began to wonder, why are Halakha observing Jews not leading the charge for climate change? In fact, does Halakha have anything at all to say about climate change? It occurred to me that Halakha was developed during a different climactic era, during the Holocene era of our climate. And we're living in a new age of warming. So if I'm choosing between a gas-guzzling car and an electric car, does Halakha have anything to say? Eating meat on Shabbos, flying to Israel, koshering with natural gas, does Halakha have a way to navigate these issues? How could it have nothing to say? I posed these questions to rabbis before, and I received fairly vague answers. But as a climate activist and a recently ordained rabbi, I have really been trying to spend my adult life using these spheres of my life. And for me, a deep culminating moment was when I turned to my Rebbe, Rabbi Haggai Resnikoff, and I asked him this. I said, does Halakha have anything to tell us about climate change? And he took me seriously. He has actually spent the last 2 years working on an answer to that question. And he is going to present his profound and groundbreaking answer in just a moment. Rabbi Resnikoff teaches Talmud and Halacha and is the director of community learning at YCT. And I turn to him now with deep gratitude.
Thank you, Hody. Excuse me, Rabbi Nemes, Dr. Friedman. The next hour plus is devoted to talking about Halacha and climate. It will be structured as follows. I'll give a 10-minute summary of my work on climate and Halacha. We'll then hear a series of Talmidei Chachamim, Rav Benny Lau, Rabbanit Michal Tikuchinsky, Rav David Bigman, Rav Yuval Sherlow, and YCT's own president and Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Dov Linzer, respond to and critique my arguments. Then I'll be back with two more Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Daniel Wolf and Rabbi Amalia Haas, to reflect on the critiques and to answer your questions. Let's begin. 2 years ago, when I began thinking about having a climate conference, my student, now Rabbi Hody Nemes, a climate activist himself, noted to me that he was interested in finding answers to the following questions. Does the halakha have anything to say about what kind of car he should buy? Does he need to buy a hybrid or electric car, assuming he can afford it? Does the halakha demand that he fly less? Those were his questions. I added a few more. Does the halakha demand that we stop eating meat? Industrial agriculture, and especially meat production, is a major source of greenhouse gases. Does it prohibit investing in fossil fuels? Does it demand that we sell stocks that we currently hold in fossil fuel companies? These are the questions I have worked on for the past 2 years. I won't deny that although I was willing to paskin that there is no halakhic concern for these behaviors, I was actively looking for the halakha to treat the climate crisis with some stringency. I began by considering my limitations. Damage from greenhouse gas emissions are challenging for halakha for 3 reasons. Number one, they are byproducts of activity that are often positive, important, and sometimes absolutely necessary for our society. That cancels out any arguments from Bal Tashchit, the prohibition on indiscriminate destruction. Number two, many of the greenhouse gases are not in themselves toxic to humans. It is their indirect effect that causes damage. They prevent heat from being released from the atmosphere, which causes the planet to heat up, causing desertification, extreme weather, and rising sea levels. Number three, the contribution of the individual to this damage is very, very, very small compared to the overall damage that 8 billion people have created. These last 2 considerations made me abandon any attempt to use the normal case of nizikin, tort law, to address my issue. It seemed to me that because the damage is so indirect and so small in any individual case, we cannot apply the Talmudic dictum, grama benizikin asur. Even indirect damage is forbidden. Therefore, I turned away from the intuitive approach of damages and moved into the realm of danger, sakana. The evidence shows that climate change is a significant danger to the entire world. Computer models predict that hundreds of thousands of lives will be lost annually in the next 30 years as a direct result of climate damage. Recent studies have found that 1/3 of heat-related deaths alone annually worldwide can be directly associated with climate change. And climate change is associated with other negative phenomena such that preventing the global temperature from rising 3 degrees by the end of the century, which there's no way we will do, would save 150 million lives, as you've heard. This data indicates that climate change is a major sakana. Sakana is also a helpful category because the Torah is ultra sensitive to the activities that endanger human life. Chamira sakanta meisura, the Talmud tells us. Danger is a stricter category than sin. In the Mishnah, in Tractate Avodah Zarah, and the resultant Halakhic ruling in the Tur and Shulchan Aruch, our most significant Halakhic codes, I encountered the following law. It is forbidden to build a courthouse together with or on behalf of a non-Jewish court system. The reason is that the Mishnah and its interpreters fear that in this building, Jews will be framed for crimes they did not commit and be put to death as a result. Here is a case of extremely indirect damage where the contribution of a single individual is virtually negligible. Yet, it is absolutely forbidden to participate in this building process. I argue that this law can be extended to forbid climate emissions today. There are some problems. Some authorities say that building the courthouse is forbidden because of lifnei iver. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind. That is, the Torah forbids to murder even to non-Jews. Building them a courthouse, well, they will legitimate and possibly commit murder, assists them in breaking the Torah. I counter that the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah along with the majority of early authorities, believe that the problem is danger, not lifnei iver. Furthermore, I argue that the problem with assisting murder is not helping someone break the Torah, but rather murder. The Halakhic concern with the climate crisis would similarly be to prevent loss of life. So the gap between lifnei iver and sakana is just not that wide. But releasing greenhouse gases, and this is the second problem, is not the same activity as building a courthouse. How can you take a prohibition that the sages said was about one thing and turn it into a prohibition on something else? I argue that creating a life-threatening hazard is a Torah-based prohibition. The sages identify cases that serve as prototypes for the kinds of dangers that are prohibited. There is still space, however, to identify new danger. This is a crucial step in my process and is based on the positions of the Beit Yosef, the Chatam Sofer, and the Minchat Chinuch. Another problem still exists. If we're allowed to release greenhouse gases at all, if we're, not allowed to release greenhouse gases at all, our lives will come to a complete standstill. Maybe we're not allowed to continue having children. Maybe we have to eschew electricity and running water and planes and cars. Saying that releasing carbon emissions is forbidden because of sakana is tantamount to saying that living modern life is forbidden because of sakana. Therefore, I limit my ruling in a major way. It can't be that our entire modern lives are forbidden. Therefore, we don't know where to draw the line. However, we don't know where to draw the line. Therefore, before we buy a plane ticket, order the steak, or invest in fossil fuels, we have to consider whether this is really necessary. Tzorech gadol, a major necessity. Is it for your livelihood? Is it for your family doing a mitzvah? Is it worth the possibility that we're illegally causing danger to others and to ourselves and others? The Torah doesn't demand that we stop everything, but we must think about whether the damage we cause is worth the benefit we get. I leave this consideration in the hands of the individual, but I do have my own opinions on a few matters. I don't think it's necessary to fly for vacations. I don't think it's necessary to eat meat when it's not Shabbat or Yom Tov. I don't think it's necessary to invest in fossil fuels. There are many other lucrative areas to invest in. I believe that if I need a car, I should buy an electric or hybrid car. The relative benefit of each depends on the source of electricity in your area. These are only opinions, but they influence the way I understand the halakha. We're halfway done. Once we've classified the climate crisis as sakana, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch state that there is a positive mitzvah to remove hazards from where we live. That is, we have an obligation to identify the physical hazards in our communities and neutralize them. Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perla, a 19th and 20th century Talmudist, argues that this is a communal obligation, a chova on the tzibur. So if there is an uncovered pit in the public domain, the entire community has an obligation to cover or fence it off. This is ruled as practical halacha by the Devar Avraham and the Chazon Ish in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Rav Perla adds that when community action is lacking, it is a direct obligation on the individual to neutralize public hazards. So until the community acts effectively, the chiyuv devolves on us. Based on this, I argue that each of us has a chiyuv, an individual obligation, to work to solve the climate crisis. Whether we support the organizations urging the government to subsidize green energy, or research into clean coal or other technological solutions more favored by the right, we have a halakhic obligation to be part of the solution with our money, with our votes, and with our bodies. This is actually more important than the prohibitions. The physical reduction of carbon emissions by the Jewish community would make a difference to the climate crisis, yes, but our political and cultural clout is much more powerful than our physical bodies. If we fulfilled our obligation to solve the climate crisis and joined a mass movement to demand a solution from the government and private industry and agriculture, that could really, really change things across the globe. Summing up, I argue that unnecessary climate emissions are forbidden. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to think seriously about whether an action which causes carbon emissions is truly a tzorach gadol, a great need. More importantly, we have a chiyuv as a community and as individuals to work to solve the climate crisis. These are my conclusions. It's time now to hear what Halakhic thinkers with far more wisdom, knowledge, and experience than I think of this approach. They are in order of appearance. Rabbi Yuval Sherlow, Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshivat Or Shaul in Tel Aviv and chair of the Ethics Committee of Rabbanei Tzohar. Rabbanit Michal Tikochinsky, Rosh Beit Midrash at Machon Herzog and head of the Halacha program at the Beit HaMidrash L'Nashim, Migdal Oz. Rabbi Benny Lau, whose contributions to the modern Orthodox thought in Israel and America is so vast that it's hard to believe that his only credit now is founder and director of Project 929. Rabbi Dov Linzer, president and Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and Rabbi David Bigman, Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshivat HaKibbutz Adati, Ma'ale Gilboa. It is my pleasure to invite you to turn your attention to their take on halachic approaches to the climate crisis. Welcome back. I'm joined by two more Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Daniel Wolf and Rabbi Amalia Hask, who are here to answer your questions. It's time now for you to get into the conversation. The chat is open for your questions. For those of you who are using the closed captions, please open up the chat as a separate window, and that will keep the constant comments in the chat from covering up the closed captioning. While you write your questions, I'm going to reflect for 60 seconds on what we just saw, and then turn the floor over to Rabbi Wolf and Rabbi Haas for their reflections. I want to say three things. First of all, I recant nothing. I heard no unanswerable challenges, and I'm still convinced that what I said is the halakha. But that may not be relevant, because the obvious fact remains, and this is the second point, that nobody likes austerity measures. Not rabbis, not anybody. Maybe that's the prophetic voice that Rav Benny critiqued. My desire to impose halachic austerity measures on the Jews. And as Rav Shurlo commented, even if I was able to prove my point beyond doubt, it is unlikely that that halakha would be kept. Finally, I want to point out that each of the respondents only addressed the isurim, the prohibitions. No one addressed the chiyuv, the obligation to work to solve the climate crisis. That might be my fault for dealing with the isurim at such length and detail compared to the chiyuv. Still, I'd like to think that even if the isurim are cast aside, the chiyuv remains. We have an obligation, people. Let's get on it. It's my pleasure now to introduce Rabbi Daniel Wolf. Rav Wolf was a Ram at Yeshivat Har Tzion for over 30 years, lecturing in the Kolel Gavoa there. He was the senior editor for Rav Lichtenstein's Lectures on the Talmud, which won the Israel Prize, and wrote 3 books on the Talmud. He is a renowned expert on various fields of halakha, including tum'ah and ribit. The interface of halakha and the modern world is also an interest of his research, and he has delivered lectures on various modern halachic topics. Rav Wolf, what is your reflection on what's been said so far?
First of all, I'd like to, let me just say amen to all the praises that Rabbi Resnikoff gathered. Beyond that, I think the discussion of Grum and Garmi sort of missed the boat, and that although there's an incredible amount of material on the definition of Grum and Garmi, that doesn't mean that it's allowed. Most of the discussion is whether it creates a chiyuv, an obligation to pay post facto. That doesn't imply anything about whether it's mutar. And obviously, the Gemara even says that even though grama b'nizikin is patur, it's chayiv b'dei shamayim, that there's a moral obligation to give restitution. Obviously, if there's a moral obligation to restitute, even though it's not enforceable in a court, obviously it's not allowed. What's not clear is how far can that prohibition go? And that's not clear. As far as what Rabbi Bigman said about Niskei Shchenim, I think a lot of global warming, Niskei Shchenim has to do with something that I'm doing in my Dal Ramot, in my property. Transportation is public. Electric generation is public. So all those things have nothing to do with Niskei Shchenim. As far as the Heter of Derech Eretz, I found I'm more nonplussed by that issue as well. I would like to, I think Rabbanit Michal mentioned this Gemara, and I think this is a central thing. We have a Gemara that Asar Tznaim Hitna Yoshua, that Yoshua made 10 conditions, and much of it is about the use of Rishut Rabbim. One of those even refers to water usage. And that, I think, that shows, and the Gemara expands that those conditions also exist in Chutz La'aretz, not only Tisa La'aretz in Israel, but everywhere in the world, so that there seems to be a responsibility, a policy responsibility of government and society to protect the world and to make it a productive place. 2 other sources which I think could be quoted. The Gemara quotes the Pasuk in Yeshayahu, lo tohu Lo notzar ha'olam, lo nivra ha'olam, the world was not created. Ela b'shvil pru urvu. Shenemar lo tohu b'ra'ah, l'shevet yitzhara. The world was not created for chaos, but for man to dwell within. And that is why the world was created. And therefore we have different obligations based on that. But the theme being that man has responsibility not to allow the world to devolve into chaos. In addition, also we have another pasuk which is more midrashic, but I think it can be also expanded on, where after the Mabul it says lo. It says v'shichet kol basar darko la'aretz. All flesh or all living beings have destroyed the world, have ruined the world. And the Gemara and the Medrash and the Rabbi talks about that even when I plant one growth, another growth comes up. So there's obviously some kind of notion of destroying the world. And of course, one can quibble whether that applies to cloning or, but I think in the extreme example of global warming, where we do see a serious deterioration in the conditions of the earth, that would be included. As far as a person, so I would say definitely that there's, I would echo what Rabbi Resnikoff quoted in terms of a pearl of there being a societal commendation. The specific recommendations, both in society and the personal, is I find difficult to delineate exactly what the thermostat on our houses should be, how big houses we should have. People talked about electric cars, how big cars we should have, how much effort should I take to take mass transit rather than my car. All those technical details are extremely difficult for me to divine, and obviously let's say a halting of all tourism would really bring catastrophic economic effects on certain countries. So I'm deigned to, categorically answer certain things. I think the economic, if someone would actually listen to the psak, or if many people would listen to the psak, it would cause incredible economic dislocation. And I would prefer, I think most of it is on the public policy level. I do find it difficult to decide on specific policy recommendations. Yeah, I do. Rabbi Linzer asked whether, I'm not sure, I mean, the problem is, as I say, I think it's obvious that there is damaging public goods per se is, I think that's what I quoted, that there is a responsibility on society to protect the world, both for its people and for the world itself. I find it difficult to translate that principle into specific recommendations. I have some in mind, but
Thanks, Rav. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think electrical generation and renewable energy, and obviously cars should be in the forefront. Other things like meat and other kinds of technological advances seem to be necessary as well. I find it difficult to really, the Halakhic thing to propose X more than Y. I would be more for looking for it's called the low-hanging fruit, but that's for economists and policymakers to do more.
Thank you. Thank you, Rav Wolf, for that analysis. It's once again a pleasure to introduce Rabbi Amalia Haas. Rabbi Haas teaches at the intersection of Judaism, food justice, and mindfulness. An experiential educator and organic beekeeper, Rabbi Amalia has a passion for climate advocacy and Jewish honeybee education. Through her company, Be Awesome, she facilitates professional development programs and retreats grounded in Judaism, creativity, and nature. She sells raw honey for Rosh Hashanah and year round. She is the Rabbah of the Bees at the Shalom Institute in Malibu, California. She's active with Chazon, Green Faith, and the Jewish Farmer Network. Rabbi Amalia was ordained in 2020 by Yeshivat Yeshivat Maharat's Advanced Kollel Executive Ordination track, and recently completed a chaplaincy residency with the Cleveland Clinic. Previous education includes Machon Pardes, Matan, She'arim, Yeshiva University, and Oberlin College. She lives in Beechwood, Ohio with her husband, 6 children, and many bees. Rabbi Haas, your reflections?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with such a caring audience and so many of my teachers. So my thinking has really looked at how we can start to have a change of consciousness to figure out how to differently apply halakha in this time of unprecedented sort of cataclysmic change. And I think it's important to notice that what we're talking about here isn't a Jewish problem. It's really a human consciousness problem. You know, when I'm driving in the suburbs in Ohio, do I realize that I'm causing global warming? It's not something that's in my consciousness moment by moment. And in my view, a kind of halakhic formalism won't get us all the way to where we need to go. And so what I've reached for is sort of infusing that halakha with theology. And one of the texts that I've found most powerful for doing this is Shabbat 154b, where there's this story, again, Haggai mentioned that I'm a beekeeper, of Rabbi Gamliel's donkey who's laden with honey, and Rabbi Gamliel doesn't want to unload the donkey over Shabbat, and waits until the end of Shabbat, and then the donkey dies. And I think it's a very powerful metaphor for what we are sort of, experiencing with the climate. There's definitely sound reasoning supporting Rav Gamliel for not unloading the animal, but the text finally asks, isn't there an issue of tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, causing the suffering of animals here? And that's what I hear in most of our respondents is, how do we touch the bigger picture, even if we face halachic categories that don't seem to connect directly enough. Grama, there's too many levels of grama to say that there's actually an obligation. So for me, what seems particularly fruitful is what Rabbanit Tikochinsky was talking about in terms of the Reshut HaRabim, and really looking at that broader impact on the planet. If you view it as, really the public good being impacted here. Also, when Rav Linzer was speaking about end of life decisions, that it's a different way of framing entirely the question, and looking at the earth as not ours, but really as God's, and that it's not in our right to be masic the public good. So I think for me, those are very powerful approaches. I guess one other thing I just wanted to say, as someone who's a leader in the environmental movement, is that part of what's been fascinating for me is the kind of questions that I've been approached with since very recently receiving smicha in the last year from Maharat. And it's been, really interesting to be approached by people from within the Jewish environmental movement who are not necessarily halakhic in their observance, but they're coming to me with these sorts of questions. So some of them have to do with trade-offs. There are people saying, should I take the path of personal self-deprivation because it'll decrease global warming, if I give up meat entirely, if I give up, driving a car. And as I've been sifting through sources, part of what I've been looking at is not so much encouraging people on a strict path of self-deprivation, but rather to think in terms of, tithing towards fighting global warming.
How about one
yeah.
more minute?
Yes. Yeah. Or something like, changing the broader norms of the community. For example, moving towards having smaller weddings rather than really large ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to stop. I want to get to the questions.
Yeah.
And maybe that we have a little more time. The first question, I think there are lots of fascinating questions and comments in the chat. The one that I want to get to first is a question from Ms. Talia Laster, who asks as follows. I'm curious how or if the halacha of public domain and damages delineates responsibilities between people with greater or fewer financial resources, i.e. do the rich people have more of a chiyuv? And I would say on the other side, maybe more of an iser. Rabbi Amalia, what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. I need to marinate in that for a minute.
Rav Wolf, any thoughts?
Yes, one of the ironic parts of global warming is that it's really reverse. Unfortunately, the wealthier classes pollute much, much more, both in terms of country. I think I actually looked it up for the conference. America emits close to 20, per capita, emits close to 20 metric tons per person per year. This is in 2000, as of 2018. I assume it's a tad higher now. India, for example, pollutes 2.5 metric tons per capita per year. So it's actually quite reversed. In general, in halakha, there is a consideration given to the amount of financial capability in terms of doing a mitzvah essay, in terms of obligations rather than prohibitions between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. But of course, if we were talking in terms of some kind of a weaker standard, not like an Isser of being Michal Shabbos or eating not kosher, but taking reasonable steps to limit our carbon footprint. So what would be considered reasonable would obviously be dependent on the level of hardship. So on the whole, it's sort of the baseline is really reversed, that wealthy countries and classes are much bigger polluters and consumers of energy than poorer people, but that yes, I think greater demands can be made on the richer countries and the richer individuals in terms of applying the rules that almost all the speakers, Rabbi Resnikoff and all the speakers, talked about reasonable steps. Well, what's reasonable? What kind of hardship? So if someone would cut their income by 10%, and that would mean, they can't take as many vacations, that might be more reasonable than someone cutting 10% would mean that they would have cut down on the food or medical care available to them.
Thank you. Rabbi, have you had a chance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo that, in poorer countries, there's so much of living, hand to mouth. And these kinds of considerations are really not available to people that are living on that level of poverty. And all through our sources, you can see that there's always distinctions that are made between the resources of the wealthy and the poor. So
I'll just add my 2 cents, which is to say this fits into my question of tzorech gadol. And this is almost what Rav Wolf said, so I won't take very long with it, but the tzorech gadol means something different. I should translate tzorech gadol, an important need. Mm-hmm. What an important need, how much money somebody who has a lot of money needs is, I think, a different question than how much money for somebody who's hand to mouth. That gets to another question that somebody asked, which is, well, do we have to ask rabbis all the time about this? or is this a constant shaila, a question that we have to ask? And I would suggest that in cases where it's a judgment call, then yes. In cases where it's a real question of like, are you going to stop massive amounts of pollution, and you think you don't have to, I think that's a good time to go to a rabbi and see if he thinks that it's he or she thinks that it's Torah Gadol. I'll add, so one other question that caught my eye, and that's the question of rodef. Can people who are endangering millions be thought of as rodef, as somebody who is essentially pursuing someone with the intention of endangering them and ultimately ending their lives? Any thoughts on that, Rav Wolf?
Well, in rodef itself, I think there's sort of two levels. There's one level of rodef, which is sort of an extrajudicial kind of punishment, and that requires a kind of culpability or real intent to damage, or in the case of rodef, to injure. There's another secondary rodef, which is, causing one's harm. So as far as the first thing, I think that's obvious that doesn't apply. The second one, that there are certain cases where even without personal culpability, some of the rules of rodef could be applied. The phrase in the Gemara is "Meshamaya karat filei," someone by his being itself is dangerous. It might theoretically be applicable, but I think the chaos that would be affected, that anyone who decides that Exxon or General Motors is emitting too much pollutants, let me assassinate the CEO of these companies, the chaos in society would be way outweigh the gains and possibly assassinating captains of industry. So I wouldn't be a proponent. I don't think it's a good idea.
Thank you. Rabbi Amalia.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a fair amount. I think it is tough to use rodef in this line of argument. I will say, though, that I think that when society starts, when in political discussions, if there's a massive oil spill, Nigeria was on the front page of the Times today, when there's public outcry and a view that there's a company or a country that really is causing tremendous suffering, then it almost seems foolish, at least not to discuss the notion of rodef, not necessarily to say that it applies, but like our the rabbis and shuls should be talking about it, because there is it's an ethical problem. But I agree, I think it's tough to utilize it from a halakhic standpoint.